So I'm going to set up the diagram and maybe do the world splitting for game 1 from prep test 19. So first we've got to figure out if world splitting is the right strategy for this game, and we'll take our time with that. But I do also notice that one of the rules is conditional, so that might be something that we want to discuss as well. So we've got 6 consecutive days, so definitely got a sequence here, day 1 through 6, and we have 6 players. So far we've got 2 factors that are looking promising for world splitting. So we only have 6 players, so that's not too many, and we probably have a 1-to-1 ratio, right? Yeah, 1 factory per day. So we have a 1-to-1 ratio of players to positions. So yeah, the number of players basically less than or equal to 6 is a good marker there, and then the ratio of players to positions is 1-to-1. What else do we have? So we have an OR rule, which is also handy. So our first rule is that F is inspected on day 1 or day 6. So an OR rule works well for world splitting. Okay, so that's quite restrictive, right? There are only 2 positions for F. The next one, though, we just have J on an earlier day than Q. Okay, so relative position rule might not be the best for world splitting, just because it's not as like concrete, right? So there are just going to be so many options where J is earlier than Q. And Q is inspected on the day immediately before R. Okay, so that's helpful. Right, so now we have this like block of these 2 players that have to be side by side. So that's handy, and then we can also connect that, of course, to rule 2, because both rule 2 and 3 involve Q. Okay, so that's rules 2 and 3 together there, and then the last rule is the conditional rule. So if G is on day 3, then Q is on day 5, and here we're going to have to create something called the contrapositive. Okay. So the contrapositive is the only logical deduction that can be made from a conditional statement. Okay, and how do we get the contrapositive? We flip and negate. Okay, so if we start with the statement, if A, then B, and that's what the arrow represents there. Okay, so if we start with the statement, if A, then B, the contrapositive would be if we don't have B, then we don't have A. So what I've done is I've flipped, which is I've put the B on the left side and the A on the right side, and I've negated. So I've said not B, right? If B is not true, then A is not true. So to create the contrapositive here, I have to flip. Okay, so that's just the flip, and then I negate. And once I've done those 2 steps, I know that this statement here is a logical deduction. Okay, so that's something that I can now use, and I don't have to be worried about whether or not that's true. That is also true. So if Q is not 5th, then G cannot be 3rd. Okay, so this conditional rule here isn't necessarily going to apply all of the time. The conditional rule applies when it's triggered, and it's triggered when the sufficient condition is met. So the sufficient condition is on the left side, and the condition on the right side is the necessary condition. Okay, so if the sufficient condition is met, then we have to infer the necessary condition is also true. So if G is 3rd, then Q definitely has to be 5th. If that's the case, okay, so if G is 3rd up here, let's say, then Q would have to be 5th, R would have to be last, right? F is first, and then my options for the remaining positions are J and H. Okay, so right there what I've shown is really the only option that we have if G is third. But I did trigger that condition. I did add that. So these are the only options when G is third, but if G isn't third, then this isn't going to apply, right? This rule isn't going to apply. So that's a little bit tricky. So a few things are working against us in terms of world splitting, and that is, creating every possible scenario before we go into the question. So there's some things working against us here. We have a conditional rule, so that's a rule that isn't necessarily going to apply all of the time. Okay, so that's kind of like a strike in the cons column. What else do we have? We have a wild card or a floater or free agent or whatever we want to call it. We have an unrestricted player. Okay, so H, I'm just gonna say wild card for that, but there are lots of different terms that you could use for that. But an unrestricted player can really mess you up when you're trying to create all of the possible solutions, right? We want as many restrictions as we can get if we're going to do world splitting. So that's potentially a problem. And then we do have a relative position rule here. So yeah, this isn't like 100% the best scenario to be doing world splitting with. We certainly could do it because we have this block of players. So we could just vary where the block goes and create all of the solutions that way. So I will go ahead and give that a go, and then that'll also give us an opportunity to talk about when this conditional rule is triggered and when it's not. But this is one where I would say probably you could just do it without world splitting at the beginning and even do it more efficiently. But I think it's that conditional rule that it's important to have that understanding and to be able to derive the contrapositive to interpret it correctly. Okay, so let's just start with the world split based on the sequencing rule here. So we still, of course, are going to split initially just based on the position of F. Okay. Then we have a few different options for where we put Q and R. So Q and R is a little block, right? So, and we have to leave room for J. So these are the three positions where we could block out Q and R. Okay, and in all of these, F is going to be first. Okay. Excuse me. Here we have the same situation roughly, right, where we're just moving Q and R around. Okay, so we've identified all of the options for Q, all of the options for R. We aren't worried about those players anymore. Then I would go into what are the options for J, but we could also potentially go into is this rule triggered, right? So J is connected to Q, but Q is also connected to G. So if Q isn't fifth, okay, so here G isn't third, right? Then we know that. Okay, so that's that's fine, right? Not the most helpful at this point, but yeah, it's there. So if there's only one spot before the QR block, J's got to occupy it, and then the other spots are going to be occupied by either G or H. So H is our wild card, so I can throw those guys in there. now here, J could be either first or second. Here, J is either second or third. So we would have to show both of those options. So I've got to duplicate that because I have two options to show. Okay, and then the remaining spots are going to be either G or H, but in this scenario, because Q isn't fifth, G can't be third, so that's got to be H. Here, though, the third spot is taken anyways. Okay, and with these guys, we just have GH, GH, GH. Okay, so I've already created too many scenarios, really, at this point to make world splitting worthwhile, right? It's just kind of going on and on and on. So at this stage, I would probably say, okay, like I get the rules, I know how to apply them, I have a big bank of acceptable solutions that I can draw on potentially, but ultimately my time is going to be better spent just going to the questions and creating the solutions that I need to create for those questions. So I will go into the questions as well in the next video here, but I'll finish off this world splitting just to show that it is possible. It's just kind of time consuming. Okay, so here we know J has to be before, so we'd have to create 3. So I need 2 more. Okay, J, 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 right? And then we have GH remaining. Now in these, Q is fifth, so it's okay for G to be third because the consequence or the necessary condition is already met. So if I do trigger this rule, then I'm already following the rule. That makes sense. So that's not going to be a problem, but I don't have to put G third. So that's why it's really important to learn how to create the contrapositive and do it correctly, because that keeps you from making the mistake of assuming that this relationship goes both ways and that if this condition is met, that we can infer that this condition is true. And that's not the case. So that's the reason that I use an arrow here. It's to demonstrate that the relationship only goes one way. So if the sufficient condition is met, we can infer the necessary condition. But just because the necessary condition is met does not necessarily mean that we cannot infer the sufficient condition from that. The sufficient condition could be true or false. We can't infer its truth. Okay, so that would be an assumption that we would be making. It's not necessarily true. All right, G, H. And I can give like a little example of that as well that might be helpful. So when we have like a relationship between terms, so an example would be like a Labrador Retriever is a type of dog. So the example between those terms is that the dog is an umbrella term and a Labrador Retriever falls within that umbrella, along with all other different breeds of dogs, right? So what I could say is if my friend has a lab, then I know they have a dog. And I would know that that statement is true. Okay, so that statement is like, I guess, an empirically valid statement, but I would agree with the truth of that statement. But just because I agree with the truth of that statement doesn't mean that I agree with the statement, well, if you have a dog, you must have a lab. It doesn't mean that I agree with the statement that if you don't have a lab, you don't have a dog. But it does mean that I should agree with the statement that if you don't have a dog, you don't have a lab. And that's the contrapositive. So merely having a dog doesn't lead me to like a necessary conclusion. Not having a lab doesn't lead me to a necessary conclusion. But if I know that someone doesn't have a dog, then I can say that they don't have a lab. And so that formula always works. Okay, so if we flip and negate a conditional statement, we always get another statement that's true and that we can rely on. Okay, and like I said, we call that the contrapositive. These guys here actually also have names. So if we make a mistake in creating the contrapositive, there are actually terms for that. So this one here, where we have flipped, right? We've actually like reversed these two items without negating. That's called a mistake in reversal. And then this one here, where we've negated, but we haven't flipped or reversed, where we just negate, it's a mistake in negation. Okay, and this one we are treating a necessary condition as if it's sufficient, and here we would be treating a sufficient condition as if it's necessary. Okay, so those are like mistakes. So if we were trying to actually infer something from this information, we would be making a mistake. Okay, so that's like a very, very quick kind of rushed explanation of how conditional statements work on the LSAT, but hopefully, like, just as a little bit of a quick introduction, that's somewhat helpful. And because it's in video, if you want to watch it over, you can. Okay, so let's finish this up. We've got Q is not fifth here, so that means G can't be third. So I know the third position is either J or H. This can't be G. And then these guys are also going to be J, H, or G. So I'm really not bothered about creating all of the different worlds at that point. So yeah, these are all of the scenarios. I mean, it's kind of only 10, but I've used a lot of like slashes in here. So yeah, I wouldn't be thinking that this is the most efficient way to go through this game. That being said, I do think that it's a really valuable exercise to create all of the acceptable solutions for this game, because it's possible, right? I've demonstrated that it's possible, and it's like that's going to be the best way to show that you understand how to apply the rules before you move into the game. So if that's something that you wanted to do as an exercise, to say, okay, like I'm gonna, shut off the video, I'm gonna go back to the rules, I'm going to kind of note how many scenarios there are, here, and then see, can I actually create all of them? Can I do it in an organized fashion and make judgment calls as to like which rules I'm going to apply first because they're more restrictive, and create some structure? I think that's really handy, and making sure that you understand how that conditional rule applies, I think, is also a really valuable part of this particular game. If you have questions about this game or any of the other stuff involving that conditional rule, definitely let me know. But yeah, I mean, this video went a lot longer than I was anticipating because I got a bit off on a sidetrack there. I will go through all the questions as well in other videos, but like I said, I would encourage you to try to recreate these scenarios for yourself before you do that, before you watch the videos for the questions. And in the videos for the questions, I actually won't even use the scenarios. I'm actually just going to apply the rules. Yeah. If you want me to do other videos where I do use the scenarios, we can do that, but usually once you've got the scenarios, it's a lot easier to do the questions. So I'll show you the efficient way to do it without having all of the scenarios made beforehand.